Okay, so we're going to have a slightly uncomfortable conversation today. And I'm sorry in advance, but we have to talk about Jason Arday. Now, full disclosure before we get into this, because I think this is very important, I got my hands on a very early review copy of this book. I read it and I decided not to review it. And the reason I didn't review it is actually pretty simple. I didn't believe the story I was reading. There were things in this book that didn't line up with things I'd heard previously. There were details that changed massively, events that could possibly not happen, and events that couldn't be backed up with anything other than what he said, rather than actual evidence, especially in academic circles. So when you put that next to other versions of events as well, things just didn't make sense. And I do remember sitting there thinking, I'm not going to review this. Because what am I supposed to do? Sit here and give a star rating while questioning whether some of the fundamental things I'm being told are true are actually true. So no, I didn't review it. And obviously, everything that's happened since has put that decision into a very different context. Because there is a lot surrounding Jason Arday's academic work. Plagiarism, questions about elements of his biography, questions about stories that were presented about his life, and questions about how someone could get as far as he did within academia if some of those allegations have turned out to be true. And I think we need to have a very serious conversation about that. Because I've been watching what's been happening online, and honestly, I think we're losing the plot a bit. And I'm probably going to say something that a lot of people aren't going to like. I think Arday was a metaphorical sacrifice. And no, I'm not talking some bizarre conspiracy theory. No one's wearing robes. I don't think there's been a secret meeting. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what happens when an institution builds someone up as a symbol. We've seen this before. Someone comes along and ticks all the right boxes. They have an incredible story, they've overcome adversity, they've got a compelling personal history. They become an example of what an institute wants to present, and people love that. Universities definitely love it, media loves it, and social media will eat it like it's ice cream. Everybody gets to point at this person and go, look at this, look at what is possible. And then something happens. The story starts falling apart. Questions get asked, and they get asked even more. Somebody actually starts looking at the paperwork, and somebody starts looking at the academic work. And somebody starts comparing the biography with previous accounts. I do think the publisher of this book should have done better. Fact checkers exist for a reason. And then suddenly, the person who's being held up as an example becomes the person everyone points at and goes, look at the problem. And that's where I think we need to stop for a minute, because, like, regardless of what happens, whether the allegations are true or not, and I'm saying that very specific way, I want to know how this happened. There are questions I'm interested in. And these questions are simple. For the sake of any argument, let's say things are fully and utterly, all the allegations are substantial and so on and whatever. How did he get here? How did this happen? Who checked the work? Who read it? Who reviewed it? Who approved it? Who promoted him? Who gave him opportunities? Who was looking at the academic work? Because we're talking about plagiarism on a serious scale. Particularly if you're talking about materials being copied and pasted from other academics, and potentially even retaining the grammatical errors. That's not a little mistake. That's not somebody forgetting a quotation mark. That's not someone getting a citation slightly wrong. If that is what happened, that's a fundamental academic failure. And well, let's be real, if it had been anyone else, I like to think that the same standards would have been applied. Because I'm pretty sure if it had been someone else, the appropriate standards would have been applied. That's what academic standards are supposed to be. You do the work, you cite your sources, you demonstrate that your work is yours. You don't just copy someone else's and hope nobody notices. I don't care. how inspirational your biography is. I don't care how many people you've inspired or awards you've won. I don't even care how many people have written articles about you. The work still has to be good. And that's where I think academia has a very uncomfortable problem, because they've created an environment where people's stories matter far more. And I understand why, I really do. If someone comes from a difficult background, they've achieved something extraordinary, that's a great story, of course it is. But at some point, somebody has to open the book. Somebody has to read the dissertation. Someone has to look at citations. Someone has to check claims. Someone has to say, hang on a minute, does this actually make sense? And I don't think enough people are willing to have that conversation, because sometimes the story is just a good one. And I think that's what's happened here. Again, allegedly. I'm being very deliberate about that. There are allegations, and I'm not sitting here pretending I'm conducting a massive investigation, but I did read a book, and I noticed things. I noticed that the details weren't always consistent. I noticed that some of the stories seemed to change. When I read it, I thought, this is strange. That's why I didn't review it. I didn't want to sit here and pretend everything was fine and talk about a biography, when clearly there's been something wrong for a long time, and things do not hold up. And now we've got questions being raised. So naturally I'm going to talk about it. But there's another part of this I find really bizarre. That's the anti-Semitism, because I've seen people online turning this into some academic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And I'm genuinely trying to work out the logic. I really am. How did we go from these allegations that an academic lied about elements of his biography and allegedly plagiarized work go to, it's all because of the Jewish people? How? Where's the connection? What am I missing? Because I don't see it. And I've seen versions of this across different social media platforms, and I've seen other conspiracy theories go around this as well. And this is exactly the sort of thing that makes serious conversation impossible. If you want to investigate alleged plagiarism, investigate it. If you want to investigate someone's biography, go for it. If you think a university has failed in its responsibilities, investigate that. If you don't get to But you don't get to take a legitimate question and attach an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory to it, and then somehow expect everyone to take you seriously. That's ridiculous. And it actually helps nobody. Because now the conversation isn't about academic standards anymore. I'm seeing this turn more into a conspiracy theory. I've seen everything from anti-Semitism to the Illuminati to more. And people that can use the conspiracy theory to dismiss any other questions being asked. That's not useful. And I think it's important because there are genuine questions about academia here. We have spent years talking about responsibility, talking about diversity. We've spent years talking about giving people opportunities. Fine. But there has to be a point where you say, okay, great, now let's look at the work. That's it. Let's look at the work. Does it hold up? Is it original? Is it properly sourced? Can this claim be verified? Are these qualifications legitimate? Are the publications legitimate? If there are problems, these problems need to be dealt with. Doesn't matter who the person is. And I actually think that's one of the reasons that stories like this have become so explosive. Because once somebody becomes a symbol, people stop seeing them as an individual. They become the representation of something. And then there is the metaphorical sacrifice. Because once the person becomes a symbol, they can be used by everyone. They're useful to the institution when the story is good. They're useful to activists when the story fits the politics. They're useful to media when the story is inspiring. And then when everything falls apart, they're useful as an example of what went wrong. And suddenly everybody gets to point at this person, but nobody wants to ask about the people who were standing around this person. Again, the bit that interests me. Who was checking? Who was approving? Who was saying yes? Who was reading this material? Who was looking at the biography? Who was making these decisions? Because people don't genuinely become senior academics in a vacuum. There are institutions involved. There are hiring processes. There are promotional processes. There are publishers and reviewers. Then there are people who sign things off. So if this was widespread misconduct, if the allegations are true, then there's going to be a lot of people who need to explain what happened. And that's probably a much more uncomfortable conversation than simply saying, well, Jason Arday was a fraud. Because the institution gets to wash its hands. The person becomes the problem. Everything else, everyone else, gets to go home and gets pushed aside. And I don't think that's enough. Now, obviously, there's also the fact that he has passed away. And I want to be very careful here. I don't think we should celebrate that in any way, shape, or form. It's bad karma. And I've seen people do that, and I've seen people essentially treating his passing like some kind of victory. And that's incredibly uncomfortable. And that's a nice word. Far nicer than that, I was thinking. Whatever happened, there are people who knew this man personally. There are people who loved him, there are people who are grieving, and regardless of who it was, especially in this case, his passing is a tragedy. And I don't think that needs a qualifier. But I also don't think that his passing means that you have to stop asking questions. There are other extremes that I'm seeing. Suddenly, because this person has passed, people are saying, how dare you discuss what he did? Well, no. That's not how the world works. If there are legitimate questions about somebody's professional life, whose questions can't disappear when they've passed away. And I think psychologically there's something else happening here. And I'm going to put a big disclaimer on this because I'm not diagnosing Arday at all. I didn't know him personally, didn't assess him, and I'm not sitting here with a clipboard. Well, according to my professional assessment, no, that's not what I'm doing. But I do have a background in criminal psychology, and there is something very interesting about what happens when someone's identity suddenly becomes completely wrapped in a particular versions of themselves, because we've all seen it. You see people online who've created an enormous narrative about who they are, and then somebody challenged one's little bit of it, and suddenly they desperately trying to explain it. Then another detail gets challenged, then another, and eventually they're not just defending the original story anymore, they're defending the person they've created. And I think that's become an enormous psychological problem on the internet and in real life. Because if your entire identity is wrapped around being a particular kind of person, what happens when people say, well, I don't believe you? What happens when the evidence starts contradicting the story? What happens when the people who once praised you are suddenly asking questions? Again, I don't know what was happening inside Arday's head. Nobody watching this video knows, but I think it's worth understanding that kind of psychological pressure. Because once somebody their public identity becomes enormous, the collapse of that identity can be devastating. And I think that's why the language around this, all of this, needs to be careful. I've seen people throwing diagnoses. I've seen people saying they know exactly what kind of person he was. I don't. You don't. I didn't know him. You didn't know him. I read the book. I read the articles. I watched interviews. That's my connection to this. And I've noticed the things that don't make sense. That's all I'm claiming. But I think what we're seeing now is the consequences of a much bigger problem. And the problem is what happens when institutions invest in a story. Because once you're invested in that story, admitting the story might be wrong becomes incredibly difficult. You have to admit that people made mistakes. You have to admit that people didn't check things. You have to admit someone got promoted who perhaps shouldn't have been. You have to admit that people believing something because it fits in what they wanted to believe. Nobody likes doing that. Nobody wants to say, well, we got this wrong. So instead, you find one person, you invest in them, you remove them, you condemn them. And everybody gets to say, well, we dealt with the problem, but did you? Or did you just find the easiest person to blame when the problem Jason Arday was a symptom of a much bigger problem. He was just a symptom of what's happening in academia in 2026. Because if the allegations are true, Arday didn't create the entire academic system. He didn't create the university hiring process. He didn't create academic publishing. He didn't create institutional diversity policies. He didn't create the culture that allowed people to access and accept particular narratives or notions. He was a person operating inside the system. If he abused the system, then he should still be held accountable. But the system needs to be examined. That's the part I think people don't want to talk about. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe all of this turns out to be something completely different. Maybe some of the allegations are disproved. Maybe some of them are true. Maybe that's much more complicated explanation for some of the inconsistencies. Who knows? And I'm particularly worried because I know people within academia, and a lot of people are having conversations about stuff and stuff that's happening, and a lot of people have said this exact sentence: Arday was a symptom of a much bigger problem. I think that something the internet has forgotten how to do is just saying I don't know. It's a perfectly acceptable answer. But I do know that when I read the book and just sitting there making that decision, I couldn't just get my head around it. This didn't line up. I Googled stuff. I was looking up stuff. I asked people I know to double check. I think we need to start genuinely talking about academia, what's happening in British universities and universities around the world. And let's look at why someone can become such a powerful symbol that nobody seems willing to question. And let's leave the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories out of it. Let's leave all conspiracy theories out of it, by the way, because they don't help. That's it. They don't help in this situation. The academic institutes themselves need to be examined independently. And I'm going to be really honest, this doesn't need to be another internet pylon where one gets 5 minutes of outrage and we move on to the next scandal. I want to know how we got here. I want to know why people didn't ask questions. I want to know why standards weren't applied. And I want to know what happens next. It's simple. That's how it should work. So like I said, I read the book. I didn't review it. Something didn't sit right. But now there are much bigger questions being asked. So let's actually have a conversation about it. Let's have one based on actual evidence. Because at this point, I think somebody has... everyone on the internet has probably had enough of the mythology. Let's talk about what actually happened and the failures within the system that produces symptoms like Arday. I'm Darth James. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Like, sub, do the usual, and remember to check out my Patreon and my channel memberships. See you in the next one.